The Las Vegas Martial Arts Expo was always a massive event, but this year it felt legendary. Posters of martial arts icons covered the arena walls, crowds rushed through the entrance, and energy pulsed through the air like electricity. People had traveled from all around the world just to see two names, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal. Chuck arrived first, walking through the backstage corridor with his usual confidence. Cameras flashed, fans shouted his name, and he greeted everyone with a grin. He was the cowboy of martial arts, charismatic, bold, and always ready with a joke. Steven Seagal, on the other hand, was a different storm. Calm, silent, focused. He walked with the smooth, deliberate steps of someone who could break your balance with one finger. Wherever he passed, people moved aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. His dark shades, long coat, and slow, heavy presence made him look like a monk who also happened to be a warrior. Both legends were invited for a friendly demonstration. But backstage, things were anything but friendly. As Steven went through quiet Aikido movements, slow circles, subtle footwork, gentle redirects, Chuck watched with a smirk. "Is that it?" Chuck joked loud enough for nearby fighters to hear. "Looks like dancing more than fighting." Laughter erupted from a few martial artists behind him. Steven simply inhaled, exhaled, and continued practicing, unbothered. Chuck wasn't done. "I mean, come on," he said, mimicking Steven's circular arm movement. "If I waved my hands like that in a real fight, somebody would put me to sleep." More laughter. A camera crew nearby caught the moment, and whispers spread fast. "Chuck is mocking Aikido. Does Steven know? Are they going to clash on stage?" Steven finally glanced up, just once. No anger, no reaction, just a calm, unreadable stare. That stare alone made two cameramen take a step back. Minutes later, the announcer called both icons to the main arena. The crowd's roar echoed like thunder. Thousands of fans rose from their seats, phones up, waiting for a historic demonstration. Chuck stretched his shoulders, rolled his neck, and smirked. Steven walked forward slowly, hands relaxed by his sides, expression unmoved. The stage was set. The tension was real. And what Steven would do next would shock every fighter in the building. The arena lights dimmed, and a deep bass vibration rolled through the stadium. The crowd erupted as two massive screens lit up with slow-motion highlights of Chuck Norris' legendary kicks and Seagal's iconic joint locks. It felt less like an expo and more like a heavyweight championship fight. Chuck Norris walked out first, waving confidently to the cheering audience. His smile was relaxed, charming, and full of swagger. Fans adored him. He had the charisma of a movie star and the reputation of a martial arts pioneer. Every step he took down the ramp felt like he owned the building. Then the spotlight shifted. Steven Seagal stepped into the light. Suddenly the crowd's volume changed, not louder, but deeper. A different kind of energy. People weren't screaming, they were staring. The kind of silent tension that happens when a dangerous animal enters a room. Steven walked slowly, almost gliding. His hands rested calmly on his stomach, and his eyes stayed hidden behind dark sunglasses. His presence alone was enough to quiet half the audience. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, two legends, two icons, one stage, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal." The crowd exploded again. Chuck bowed playfully, giving Steven a grin. Steven nodded back, slow, subtle, unreadable. The mats were set up in the center of the arena, clean, bright white, surrounded by cameras. Dozens of martial artists in uniforms lined the edges, ready to assist or react. Chuck grabbed the microphone first. "Before we begin," he said jokingly, "I just want to apologize to Steven." The crowd murmured. Steven raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Steven asked calmly. Chuck smirked. "For what I'm about to do to your Aikido." The crowd laughed loud. Cameras flashed. Even some martial artists chuckled nervously. Steven's face didn't change. Chuck continued, lifting his arms in an exaggerated circular motion, parodying Aikido. Look, I know his style is flowing. Circular. Peaceful. But let's be real. If someone attacks you in the street, you're not going to dance around them. More laughter. Steven just stared at him with a patient stillness that somehow made the room colder. The announcer quickly stepped in to restore order. Okay, gentlemen, let's begin with a light demonstration. Chuck nodded, still smiling. Light. Sure. I'll go easy. Steven stepped forward, hands relaxed, posture loose. Chuck bounced on his feet. Steven didn't move. Chuck threw a playful jab at the air, not even aimed at Steven. The crowd laughed again. Then Chuck attacked. A gentle, easy, nothing serious attack, meant to show off. Steven didn't block. He didn't step back. He simply shifted his weight and guided Chuck's arm away like dust floating off a table. Chuck blinked. What was that? He said, surprised despite himself. Steven didn't speak. Chuck tried again, this time with a bit more intention. Steven slid just a few inches, turned his wrist, and Chuck's balance slipped for half a second. Not a fall, just enough to make him widen his stance quickly. The martial artists around the ring murmured. They knew balance loss when they saw it. Chuck smiled, trying to play it off. Okay, that was interesting. But inside, the first spark of competitiveness flared. He moved faster now, light punches, a sweeping kick, testing distance. Steven's feet barely moved. He simply pivoted, redirected, and dissolved every attack like water shifting around a stone. Chuck's smirk faded slightly. The crowd sensed the tension changing. A hush fell across the arena. Someone in the front row whispered, "He's not even trying." Chuck suddenly threw a faster strike. Not hard, but sharp. Steven responded with a tiny circular motion, touched Chuck's wrist, and Chuck felt his arm lock for a split second before Steven released him. Chuck stepped back, shaking out his arm. The crowd gasped. This was no joke anymore. Steven finally spoke, voice calm and deep. You attack with force. I respond with timing. Chuck inhaled slowly and chuckled. Timing, huh? Let's see if timing stops this. He got into a real stance now, something the crowd recognized from his movies and his competition days. The arena buzzed. This was no longer playful. This was a challenge. Steven raised one hand, inviting him forward with a tiny gesture. The crowd roared. Cameras zoomed in. Commentators whispered, "Here we go." And right here is your engagement break. White medium star engagement break. Apko Kia Lagda High. Steven Seagal Aikido Real Fight Main Com Karta High. Or AAPISS Whack Count SI Country or Count SI City SE Dek Rahiho. Comment Karka Bateo. Chuck lunged. Fast. Serious. No jokes. Steven moved only 2 inches to the left. Just 2. And Chuck missed completely. The crowd gasped. The martial artists watching nodded in awe. Even Chuck looked stunned for a moment. Steven stepped forward slightly, lowering his hands. Shall we continue? He asked quietly. Chuck exhaled. Oh, we're continuing, he said. We're just getting started. The energy in the arena was now electric. No laughter. No jokes. Everyone watching felt it. The real clash was about to begin. The roar of the arena faded into a strange, pulsing silence. The kind that only happens right before 2 warriors collide. Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal stood facing each other on the pristine white mat. Bright lights reflected off their shoulders. The crowd leaned forward, phones held high, breaths held even higher. Chuck tightened his stance. His face no longer wore the showman's grin. This wasn't about proving Aikido wrong anymore. This was about proving himself right. Across from him, Steven Seagal stood still as a mountain, hands relaxed, posture loose, breathing slow. Not tense, not aggressive, just present. He looked like he was waiting for a breeze, not a martial arts legend. A voice echoed across the arena speakers. Light demonstration, round 1. Chuck exploded forward. Fast, sharp, precise. His right hand shot out in a straight punch. Not too hard, but nowhere near soft. It was the kind of punch that demanded respect, even in a demonstration. The crowd gasped at the sudden speed. Steven's response was effortless. He didn't block. He didn't evade dramatically. He simply rotated his wrist and guided Chuck's punch past him, the way someone would sweep a curtain aside. The redirection was so smooth that Chuck stumbled half a step before regaining balance. The martial artists watching reacted immediately. Murmurs swept around the mat. Someone whispered, "Timing, perfect timing." Chuck reset his stance, nodded with a half smile, and approached again, this time slower, analyzing Steven with more seriousness. He threw a hook punch. Steven stepped inside the arc, almost lazily, and touched Chuck's elbow. That single touch sent Chuck off center by a few inches. Not enough to fall, but enough to embarrass anyone watching. Chuck inhaled sharply. Steven didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped back into his square stance. The crowd was fully invested now. Chuck rolled his shoulders. "Okay," he said under his breath. "You want to play like that?" He shifted again, this time using his famous point-fighting footwork. Quick, darting movements, testing the angles. Steven's eyes followed, calm as a monk studying wind patterns. Chuck launched a series of fast, controlled strikes. Jab, back fist, low kick, then a sudden burst toward Steven's center line. Steven absorbed the motion with a turn of his waist. His hand circled up, guided Chuck's arm, and Chuck felt his momentum spiral away from him. He was being led, redirected, unbalanced. He recovered, but he felt it, and he didn't like it. Chuck backed up a few feet, breathing just a little heavier. The crowd didn't laugh now. They didn't cheer. They watched with the reverence of people witnessing something raw and real. A man in the front row whispered, "He's controlling the space." Another added, "Chuck can't get inside. Steven is shutting him down without even striking." Chuck lifted his chin, acknowledging the shift. "Not bad," he said, "but let's see how you handle some real pressure." He moved in with intensity. A low kick, a double jab, a sudden spin to mask distance. Steven moved only when needed. Tiny steps, barely visible pivots, micro adjustments that shifted Chuck off his intended line. Every time Chuck attacked, Steven's center stayed untouched. Then, finally, Chuck connected. His fist brushed Steven's sleeve, barely grazing his forearm. The crowd gasped, "Contact." But what happened next shocked even Chuck. Steven didn't block. He didn't counterstrike. He simply rolled his arm in a circular motion that captured Chuck's wrist, not grabbing it, but guiding its momentum. Chuck felt his own arm trapped in a spiral he couldn't control. It wasn't pain. It was direction. Steven's hand slid behind the elbow, his body rotated, and in one smooth movement, Chuck's balance was gone. He didn't fall, but he had to plant his foot awkwardly to avoid it. The martial artists around the ring reacted audibly. One whispered, "That's pure Aikido. Minimal force, maximum effect." Chuck stepped back, eyes slightly widened. He wasn't angry. He was impressed, maybe even excited. He straightened his posture and nodded, acknowledging the moment. "All right," he said. "Your turn." Steven looked at him calmly. "Attack as you wish." Chuck frowned. "That's not what I meant." Steven stepped forward, tiny steps, silent, deliberate. He raised one hand, palm open. "Attack," he repeated, with intent. Chuck swallowed. He wasn't used to being told how to attack, but something about Steven's tone made him accept the challenge. He rushed in, harder now. He threw a real punch. Not a movie punch. Not a demo punch. A punch aimed at testing Steven's foundation. Steven slightly lowered his center, exhaled, and touched Chuck's wrist again. Only this time, he didn't stop at redirection. He shifted his weight, turned Chuck's force against him, and Chuck felt his own energy pull him forward. Steven stepped to the side, like wind sliding past a charging bull. Chuck stumbled, but somehow, Steven supported him mid-fall, preventing embarrassment. The crowd gasped again. Chuck stood still for a moment, processing, breathing. This wasn't luck. This wasn't showmanship. This was something deeper. Chuck raised his hands and stepped back with newfound respect. You're good, he admitted. Steven tilted his head slightly. We've only just begun. The crowd whispered and buzzed. They felt something big coming. A shift, a collision, a moment that would define the night. Because Chuck's playful energy had vanished, Steven's calm had deepened, and everyone watching sensed the same thing. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The arena felt different now. It wasn't just a friendly demonstration anymore. The energy had shifted, deepened, sharpened. Even the air seemed heavier. People in the front rows leaned forward as if afraid to blink and miss something historic. Chuck Norris wiped a line of sweat from his brow. Not from exhaustion. Chuck was still a machine, but from focus. Steven Seagal hadn't thrown a single strike, yet somehow he was dictating the rhythm. His presence was like a gravitational pull, invisible but undeniable. Chuck cracked his neck once, loosening the tension. Steven just stood there, arms relaxed, expression still calm. A referee stepped forward but hesitated, sensing the tension. Gentlemen, are we continuing with demonstration speed? Steven gave a small nod. Demonstration. Chuck responded with a half smile. Yeah, demonstration. But both men knew this was no longer just a demo. The crowd sensed it too. Someone shouted, "Let's go, Chuck." Another called out, "Show us the real Aikido, Steven." Cameras zoomed in. Fingers tightened around phone edges. Even the commentators fell silent. Chuck started circling, light on his feet, using the kind of footwork that made him unstoppable in his prime. He wanted angles, openings, weaknesses, anything he could exploit. But Steven wasn't giving any. His posture was loose but grounded. His gaze was calm but razor-focused. His hands hung like dormant weapons, ready to activate at the slightest disturbance in energy. Chuck feinted a punch. Steven didn't move. Chuck feinted a kick. Steven's eyelids didn't even twitch. It was unnerving. Chuck decided to commit. He darted forward with a sudden burst. Jab, cross, low kick, all controlled but undeniably fast. The crowd gasped at the speed. Steven shifted his weight by half an inch. Just that. Chuck felt the difference instantly. His second punch's angle closed. His kick's distance changed. He had to adjust mid-motion, throwing off his timing. Steven's hand rose, not to block, but to disrupt the line of attack. With a gentle rotation of his wrist, he brushed Chuck's arm aside and stepped in. Chuck suddenly felt a soft touch near his elbow, then a pull, a twist, a shift in gravity. His balance evaporated for a full split second. He recovered, but that second felt like eternity. The martial artists around the mat leaned forward. That's Kazushi, one expert whispered. Breaking balance without force. Chuck exhaled, lips tightening. He wasn't used to being manhandled, even subtly. All right, he muttered. Now I'm really awake. He charged in again, this time flowing from one technique to another, boxing footwork into a taekwondo-style high kick, then sliding into a low side kick aimed harmlessly towards Steven's knee. Steven didn't counter. He redirected everything. His body moved like water around a stone, except the stone was Chuck, a stone that suddenly felt like it was sinking. The crowd murmured in awe. Seagal is reading him. He's controlling tempo. He's playing chess, not fighting. Chuck, though frustrated, couldn't help respecting the mastery. There was a quiet power in Steven's movements, a natural intimacy with energy and momentum. Still, Chuck was Chuck. He wasn't going down without making a statement. He stepped back, nodded once, and inhaled deeply through his nose. Steven felt the shift. Chuck's stance lowered. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing slowed. He wasn't just fighting now, he was feeling, sensing, matching Steven's subtlety with his own. The arena tensed. Chuck moved again, but slower, smoother, letting instinct take over. His hand extended in a probing strike. No force, just intention. Steven intercepted with a small circle of the wrist. Chuck didn't resist. He followed the motion. Steven guided him. Then, just like that, they were locked in a flow. A slow, spiraling dance of push and pull, strike and redirection, tension and release. Movements too subtle for cameras, too advanced for beginners, too honest to be faked. This was martial arts, not the choreographed movie version, but the stripped, living essence. The crowd fell silent, not out of boredom, but out of reverence. Something sacred was happening on the mat. Chuck suddenly ramped up the pace, a burst of speed inside the flow. Steven adjusted instantly. He stepped, turned, and in one elegant motion, placed his hand on Chuck's wrist, rotated his hips, and Chuck felt his world tilt. His feet left the ground for a fraction of a second. His center flew forward. His balance dissolved entirely. Steven could have slammed him. He didn't. Instead, he caught Chuck mid-fall, guiding him safely to the mat with a control so gentle it almost felt respectful. Silence. Then a collective inhale, an arena-wide gasp. People stood. Cameras flashed. Commentators lost their minds. That was Aikido. That was real Aikido. He took Chuck's balance clean. Chuck stayed on one knee for a moment, absorbing the reality of it. Not humiliation, not defeat, but truth. He looked up at Steven, who simply offered his hand in calm invitation. Chuck gripped it and rose. For the first time tonight, his smile wasn't playful. It was genuine, respectful, acknowledging. "You got me there," Chuck said quietly. Steven nodded once. "You gave me the energy. I returned it." The crowd applauded, a wave of thunder. And yet, even through the cheers, everyone sensed it. This wasn't the climax. This wasn't the end. Something bigger was coming. Because Chuck narrowed his eyes, Steven tightened his stance, just slightly, and the referee nervously stepped back. The air grew electric again. Round 2 was about to begin. And this time, there would be no holding back. The arena felt like it was vibrating. Chuck Norris stood tall again, rolling his shoulders, resetting his center. Steven Seagal remained still, calm, heavy, and unmoved, like a mountain that had no reason to shift unless provoked. The audience sensed it. The commentary box sensed it. Even the security staff along the walls sensed it. The real test was about to begin. Chuck wiped his palms on his pants. Not because he was nervous. Chuck Norris didn't get nervous, but because he respected what just happened. Steven had taken his balance flawlessly, not with force, not with aggression, but with understanding. Chuck lifted his hand slightly. "Okay, Steven," he said with a faint grin. "Now let's see what happens when I stop playing nice." A ripple of excitement shot through the crowd. Steven simply replied, "Use whatever energy you like. I'll use the same." The simplicity of the statement only made it more intimidating. Chuck began circling again, but this time his steps were wider, heavier, more tactical. He was choosing angles like a veteran sniper, not to attack recklessly, but to test the structure of Steven's stance. Steven didn't follow. He pivoted slowly, letting Chuck orbit around him. Chuck switched gears in a heartbeat. First a fast jab, controlled but sharp. Steven brushed it off. Then a quick front kick, light, probing. Steven shifted half a step to neutralize it. A spinning back kick, beautiful, precise, cinematic. Steven simply wasn't there anymore. He stepped aside without any dramatic flourish, as if guided by instinct alone. Chuck landed lightly on his feet again, impressed. "You're hard to hit," Chuck muttered. "I'm only where I need to be," Steven replied. Then, without warning, Chuck struck. He closed the gap with a sudden burst, using a hybrid combination of karate snapping strikes and taekwondo footwork, fast enough that even seasoned fighters couldn't track each moment. Steven lifted his hand, intercepted Chuck's forearm, and flowed into a turning motion that tried to use Chuck's speed against him. But Chuck anticipated it. He planted his foot, lowered his stance, and resisted the pull, something most people couldn't do against Steven. Gasps erupted. Steven's eyebrow rose slightly. Chuck smirked. "That won't work twice," Chuck whispered. Steven didn't argue. He simply changed the angle. This time he didn't pull. He pushed. Chuck's balance rocked backward, only a hair. But that hair was enough for Steven to slip inside Chuck's guard and apply a subtle wrist control. Chuck felt the torque immediately. He countered before the lock fully formed, spinning out with an old-school Tang Su Du technique. The movement surprised even Steven. The crowd roared. Two legends. Two styles. Two worlds colliding. One hard, one soft. Chuck stepped back, exhaled hard, and then snapped forward again. He swung a looping hook, not to hit Steven, but to set up the next move. Steven moved to redirect, and that's when Chuck swept. It was quick, clean, dangerous. Steven's leg lifted off the ground for a brief moment. The arena froze. Had Chuck actually gotten Steven Seagal off balance? Steven landed again, but it was noticeable. A tiny slip, a minor break in his structure. Chuck's grin widened. I finally saw your center shift. Steven looked down, almost amused. Good. Now you understand. Chuck didn't wait. He charged with a second burst. Knees, elbows, feints, all flowing into one cohesive attack. Steven redirected what he could, avoided what he couldn't, and absorbed the rest with impeccable timing. But the pressure was building. Chuck was forcing movement now, forcing reactions, bringing speed and power that made even Aikido's calm waters ripple. The crowd's energy surged like a storm. Then it happened. Chuck threw a lightning-fast spinning heel kick, not at full force but still dangerously sharp. Steven raised his arm to redirect it, and Chuck used the rotation to grab Steven's wrist. A hush fell across the arena. Chuck Norris now had Steven Seagal's arm. For a split second, the entire martial arts world held its breath. Chuck tried to pull Steven into a throw. Steven did not move. At all. It was like trying to throw a building. Chuck adjusted his grip. He used leverage. He shifted his hips. He executed the technique perfectly. Steven still didn't budge. Chuck's eyes widened for the first time. Steven's voice broke the silence. You cannot throw what is rooted. Then Steven moved. Not fast. Not explosively. Just decisively. He rotated his arm, reversed the wrist control, stepped forward, and in one fluid motion, captured Chuck's momentum, shifted his balance, and locked his center. Chuck felt it immediately. The world tilted again. Only this time, Steven didn't guide him down gently. He executed a clean, powerful Aikido throw, smooth enough to be beautiful, strong enough to shock the arena, fast enough to make Chuck flip over Steven's hip and land hard but safely. Thud. The sound echoed through the entire stadium. The crowd exploded. Oh my God, he threw Chuck. Seagal actually threw Chuck Norris. Chuck lay on his back for a moment, eyes wide, chest rising and falling, processing what just happened. Steven stood over him, calm as ever, hand extended once again. Chuck accepted it slowly, gripping Steven's wrist as he got to his feet. Breathing heavily, Chuck finally said the words no one expected to hear. Okay, Steven. That one shocked even me. Steven nodded once. But everyone knew. The real moment that would silence the entire arena was still coming. The crowd was no longer just cheering. They were vibrating with excitement. Phones were held so tightly that fingertips turned white. Martial artists in the VIP rows were whispering furiously, analyzing every micro-movement, every breath, every shift in weight. Chuck Norris took a deep inhale, rolling his neck with a slow crack. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't shaken. If anything, he looked more alive than ever, energized, awakened, fully present. Steven Seagal, as always, stood like a silent mountain. No smile, no victory expression, just calm, controlled breathing. A warrior with nothing to prove and everything to demonstrate. The referee stepped forward nervously. Should we continue? Chuck looked at Steven. Steven looked back. Two legends. Two giants. Two philosophies. Chuck shrugged, grinning. Steven nodded once. The match resumed. The audience roared as Chuck launched forward again, this time bringing the intensity of a real fight, but still within demonstration safety. His punches snapped through the air with controlled fire. His kicks sliced the space around Steven like sharpened blades of wind. Steven did what Steven did best. He didn't meet force with force. He dissolved it, redirected it, neutralized it. Each time Chuck struck, Steven shifted subtly, gliding around the energy like he was made of smoke. Every now and then, he would gently touch Chuck's wrist, shoulder, or elbow, small touches that sent shockwaves of imbalance through Chuck's structure. But Chuck Norris was no ordinary fighter. He wasn't some rookie who could be thrown around easily. He learned quickly, adapted instantly. With each exchange, Chuck began minimizing Steven's ability to find Kazushi off-balancing. His center became tighter. His stance became denser. He moved with a grounded flow that even impressed Steven. Whispers spread. Chuck's studying him. He's adjusting to Aikido mid-demo. This is unbelievable. Then suddenly, Chuck switched styles entirely. He abandoned kicks, abandoned circular punches, abandoned technique diversity. He went pure karate, linear, direct, powerful. A single step-in straight punch, fast, sudden, explosive. Steven raised his forearm to redirect. Chuck felt it, and immediately followed with a close-range elbow strike that nearly caught Steven by surprise. The crowd gasped. Steven avoided it by a hair. Chuck wasn't done. He pressed in, tight and suffocating, giving Steven no space to circle. Aikido was about freedom of movement. Chuck was taking that away. Smart, Steven murmured softly. Chuck winked. Adapt or get tossed, right? For the first time, Steven stepped back, and that tiny backward step triggered something inside Chuck. He exploded forward. One elbow, one knee, one shoulder bump. Everything tight, aggressive, pushing Steven past his comfort zone. Steven turned, barely. The flow was breaking. Chuck was forcing straight lines into circles, disrupting the harmony Aikido depended on. Steven redirected once, twice, but the pressure didn't stop. The arena reached a fever pitch. Chuck's pushing him back. This is crazy. He's overwhelming Seagal. Chuck seized Steven's wrist, turning it into a classic standing arm control. He stepped deep, applied torque, and shifted his hips to set up a throw. Steven's balance dipped. The crowd gasped. Was Chuck about to throw Steven Seagal? For a moment, just one, Steven's posture loosened. Chuck tightened his grip. This was the moment. This was the chance. This was the opening no one thought anyone could create. Chuck exhaled sharply and committed. He pulled. He turned. He dropped his hips. Steven moved. Not in resistance. Not in panic. But in pure internal mastery. He flowed into Chuck's movement as if Chuck had invited him in. Then, Steven stepped deeper into Chuck's space, rotated his hips, slid his arm under Chuck's elbow, and aligned perfectly with Chuck's center. Time slowed. Chuck felt it. A vacuum. A shift in reality. An effortless redirection of all the power he had generated. Steven whispered, barely audible. Now you feel it. Then, push thud. Chuck Norris was lifted clean off the ground and thrown into a perfect, devastating, lightning-fast Aikido Iriminage-style projection, but amplified with Steven's full skill and weight behind it. The sound echoed like a cannon. People stood. People screamed. People covered their mouths. It wasn't brutal. It wasn't harmful. But it was so powerful, so controlled, so perfectly executed that it silenced the entire arena. Chuck lay on his back, eyes wide, not in pain, but in absolute disbelief. He had sparred with legends. He had fought real fighters. He had trained for decades. But nothing prepared him for that. Steven stood over him, offering a hand. Chuck didn't take it immediately. He just stared at Steven, breathing hard, processing the moment. Finally, he grasped Steven's wrist and rose to his feet. Chuck exhaled, wiped sweat from his forehead, and said in a voice that carried through the entire stadium, Steven Seagal just shut the whole arena up. That throw was real. The crowd erupted like an explosion. Cheers, screams, thunderous applause. Steven bowed. Chuck put a hand on Steven's shoulder, raising the Aikido master's arm like a champion. The commentators were losing their minds. Martial artists were stunned. Fans were speechless. And cameras captured the moment that would go viral worldwide. Steven Seagal's single throw. That silenced the entire arena.